Good morning, friends. Today we're going to be talking about the Battle of Salamis, which was a decisive victory for the Greeks over the Persians, effectively ending the Persian Wars. We're going to start by reviewing yesterday's lesson about the Battle of Thermopylae. But before that, I want to remind you of a principle that I have spoken of several times this year, which is that all of the observable events of history, such as this or that battle, or so and such cultural achievement, or the arising of this or that religion, these are like gloves that fit over a hand. But the hand is a kind of invisible hand. It's the unseen forces that drive all the developments of history. And as always, in today's lesson, we're going to seek to sniff out what those unseen impulses are, that we may get a better understanding of how all of the events of history tie together to create the one human story. Now, you'll recall from yesterday the Battle of Thermopylae, where the superior strategic planning of the Greeks allowed a very small contingent of Spartan soldiers and some soldiers from other Greek city-states, greatly outnumbered by the Persians, to yet hold off the entire Persian army for 3 days. And this permitted the Athenians, Athens would be about over here, time to escape their city and take refuge in the island of Salamis before Xerxes made his way to Athens to burn it to the ground. And so today's lesson is really about what is it that allowed the Greeks to develop superior strategy in this war. Now, before I get into the Battle of Salamis, let me mention briefly that the Greeks saw the Persians as basically another tyrant. Xerxes was another tyrant to the Greeks, and all the other Persian people and their subject states were essentially his slaves. That's how the Greeks would have thought of them. But the Greeks, with all their independence, every city-state thought they were the best. They did not want to be interfered with or ruled by any other city-states. And some of them, like Athens, had worked so hard to develop democracy over hundreds of years that they weren't about to give that up now to be subject to another tyrant. So, let's back up a few years from the Battle of Thermopylae. And I want you to imagine a young schoolboy in Athens. He's being taken to school one bright and sunny morning by his pedagogue, and they have to take a path through the agora, which is the marketplace at the center of the city, in order to get to his school. And there, the young Themistocles sees merchants selling their wares in one part of the square, and in other parts there are citizens. Of course, they're all male citizens. That's how it was in Athens. They didn't allow women to participate in their democracy. But there are these male citizens talking about the events of the day. Any news they've heard, or any plays they've recently seen, or they're talking about politics, they're talking about philosophy, they're talking about the state religion. And these are commoners. These aren't nobles. Some of them are wealthy, some of them are really come from quite humble beginnings, like Themistocles himself. And he's very impressed that really any common Athenian citizen can talk about these things in the marketplace. And he looks and he sees a standing stone at one end of the square, this white flat stone upon which people take turns standing up there and speaking what they believe is truth to the people of Athens. You see, they're trying to convince others of their point of view. Athens doesn't exactly have a president or somebody like that. It's really anybody who, through their good oratory and their brilliant intellect, can lead others to good ideas upon which all will vote to implement or not. And Themistocles is greatly affected by this. He's really impacted by this image. And he goes home that day and he writes his first speech. And he stands up and he pretends that he's giving a great oratory to his fellow Athenians. You see, Themistocles isn't very good at music, and he gets mocked by his classmates for that. Because in Athens, if you're not good at playing the lyre and singing, you're kind of considered a second-rate citizen. But Themistocles isn't daunted by this. He knows that he has a genius inside of him, a strategic genius. Themistocles very much lives in the ilk of cleverness that characterizes the Greek culture. They have a history of this cleverness. Even the tyrant Pisistratus from the past was very clever in the way that he employed a peasant girl from a nearby village, dressed her up like Athena, and managed to convince the Greek people that Athena herself had come to tell them that Pisistratus was to be their ruler. And so Themistocles continued to develop his cleverness, continued to develop his intelligence, much again like Odysseus, for example, had in his wanderings after the Trojan War, how he outsmarted the Cyclops and so on. And Themistocles continued to practice his oratory skills. Now fast forward a decade or two and the Battle of Marathon happens. This is when Darius, who was Xerxes' father, the former emperor of Persia, first attacked Greece. And Marathon would be somewhere over here on the map, but again, not far from Athens. And that was a decisive victory for the Greeks and a great embarrassment for the Persians. And it angered Darius so much that he vowed to come back, but he died before he could. And so his son Xerxes said, well, I will go back and crush the Greeks. Persia was an empire. It was not a group of free-thinking city-states. And Xerxes sought to bring all of Greece under his subjugation. But he was strategic. He took about 10 years to build up a huge army and a sizable navy to come back and finish what his father had failed to do. Now, after the Battle of Marathon, Themistocles rightly intuited that the Persians would be back. And he knew that the only way the Athenians could address the Persian threat was by building up their navy. But he knew that to tell the Athenians this directly would greatly upset them. They were riding high on the victory of Marathon. They were partying. They were so joyous. And the last thing they wanted to hear was a real downer. Like, oh man, the Persians are going to be back. They thought, they're gone for good. We have shown them who we are. They're not going to be back. Themistocles knew better. Now, luckily, there had just been a great abundance of silver, a silver mine discovered near Athens. And the Athenian people wanted to split the spoils of that mine amongst themselves. But Themistocles thought that would be enough money to build a fleet of triremes. Triremes were the most powerful naval vessel of the day. They had several rows of oarsmen. They were fast. They were sleek. They were maneuverable. And they had a metal kind of battering ram on the front with which they could just plow into enemy ships and destroy them. And so Themistocles, in his cleverness, he came up with a great bluff. And so he got on the standing stone and he came to speak. And by this time he had already developed a reputation for being a good speaker. And so many men there stood to listen, and he said to them, our neighboring city-state of Aegis, they're developing their navy, and certainly we want to build up our hegemony in the Aegean Sea and in the Mediterranean. We want to continue to colonize other lands, and they could really get in our way. Don't we Athenians want to be the most powerful naval force in all of Greece? I mean, we'll get great riches from these other lands. And the Athenians thought, yeah, let's do that. For an Athenian, there was nothing more important than being an Athenian. It was even more important than being a Greek. And they considered themselves superior to other city-states. And so with this bluff, he managed to convince the crowd to invest all that silver in building triremes. And they made this decision none too soon. For right after the Battle of Thermopylae, Xerxes headed straight for Athens, which was about over here somewhere on the map, and was surprised to see it deserted, but he set it to torch and burned it to the ground, and all the Athenian people who had escaped to this island of Salamis watched with sadness and grief and trepidation as the smoke and the flames rose over the hills upon their city. Now Xerxes saw this as his opportunity to crush the Greeks once and for all. So he brought his fleet of ships around, and they were formed of many different cultures, Phoenicians, Egyptians, to name a few. And his strategy was to blockade the narrow strait of Salamis so that the Greeks would either surrender or basically have to fight. But Xerxes counted on their surrendering, really. And so the night before the battle, Xerxes had his golden throne placed on the shore so that he could watch the Greek defeat with relish. And the Greek ships were anchored here by the island. And the Greek commanders were there together thinking about what to do. And Themistocles had another brilliant stroke of genius. So he sent a secret messenger to Xerxes. You see, he wanted to lure Xerxes up into the strait, knowing that there'd be hardly any room to maneuver. And Themistocles also knew the currents and the conditions of the strait would be in the favor of the Greeks. And so the messenger told Xerxes that the Greeks are scared and they're squabbling and they're planning to flee. And if Xerxes would pursue them up the strait, he could certainly score a decisive victory. Now, Xerxes certainly wasn't stupid, but he did have an Achilles heel. That was his pride. Perhaps if he had been Greek, it would have been different. But he was raised in the Persian culture, and so he was blinded by his pride, and he ordered his ships to sail or to row through the night up into the strait. But the next morning when the sun rose, they did not see what they expected. They expected the Greeks to be fleeing in terror, but rather what they saw was a battle line of triremes aimed directly at them. And as the winds of the morning picked up, the Greek ships bore down on the Persians and smashed into the Persian line, boring holes in ship after ship after ship. And Xerxes watched in shock from the shore as his fleet was being destroyed gradually by the Greeks. In fact, scarce could any water be seen for the wreckage of ships and the floating of Persian sailors' corpses in the water. Clear that the battle was lost, Xerxes ordered what ships he had left to quickly retreat and head back to Asia Minor. Shortly thereafter, a contingent of Persian land forces was defeated further to the north by the Spartans and the Thebans, and never again did the Persians as an empire attack the Greeks. So the Greeks thereby won their freedom. So what I want you to think about for tomorrow, and what we will do a short essay on, is what was the unseen impulse in the Greek culture compared with that of the Persian culture that allowed the Greeks to develop superior strategy and, though outmatched and though outnumbered, win the day. Okay, that's all for our lesson, and we're going to go on to an artistic activity now. Thank you. Okay, so I've decided that for today's artistic activity, we're actually going to make a sculpture of a trireme. Now you can see from this blueprint that a trireme would be a very detailed sculpture, and you can go really into as much detail as you wish to. I'm going to focus mainly on the hull and do a little bit of this detail in here with some clay tools. And so what you're going to want for supplies is obviously a big chunk of clay, some kind of surface you can work on. This is a piece of water-resistant drywall that I've cut into smaller boards. It's helpful to have clay tools such as this one or this one. It's a little loop there. Something like this with a flat edge, and it has a rounded carving edge on the other side. You can also use popsicle sticks. You can use pencils, little picks or stylus kind of thing if you have it. You don't absolutely need the clay tools, but they help with the finer work. Now you're also going to want a bucket of water. I don't recommend adding too much water to the clay unless it's quite dry and hard to work. And if you do add water, only do it sparingly. And the reason for that is that your clay will become weak very quickly if you add too much water, and it'll become harder then to work it. Also, once you're finished, you're going to want to rinse off your hands, all the big stuff from your fingernails and so on and so forth, in that bucket, and then pour it outside, because pouring clay down a drain can quickly clog it, and you don't want to do that. So once you've rinsed all the big chunks off your hands and there's maybe only a little bit of a film, then you can wash your hands in a regular sink. Now, for the purposes of this demonstration lesson today, in the interest of time, I'm going to speed up the video of me actually constructing the trireme. I would normally just teach it in real time. So here we go. Okay, so here we have our finished trireme, and obviously if this were a lesson I were doing with the students, I would be talking the whole way through it, and it would be done in real time, not sped up. I demonstrated a number of techniques here, shaping and carving, and even with the sides here, creating some texture with clay tools. And so there we have it, a trireme.